take this opportunity to welcome you all here to Demos today. I am Brenda Wright. I'm the director of the Democracy program here at Demos, and I'm delighted to be introducing our topic today of national popular vote. I just want to say a couple of words about Demos for those of you who may be new here, although we certainly see some familiar faces. Demos is a national nonpartisan public policy and research and advocacy center that works with advocates and researchers around the country in pursuit of four overarching goals: a more equitable economy with widely shared prosperity and opportunity, a vibrant and inclusive democracy with high levels of voting and civic engagement, an empowered public sector that has the capacity to work for the public good, and a responsible U.S. engagement in an interdependent world. We are thrilled to have you all here today for this terrific program on the national popular vote, which is a proposal advancing in states around the country to change the way we elect the president. No editorializing. and to actually ensure that the presidency goes to the person who wins the most popular votes in the United States. Yes, a simple but very interesting concept. I'm not going to say too much about it because we have three speakers here today who are terrifically well qualified to explain the national popular vote, what it's about, what the issues are surrounding how it would work, and some of the debate around its merits and its benefits for our electoral system. And so I will just go ahead and introduce our speakers and let them take over from here. And so first, we have with us today Rob Ritchie, who is the executive director of and co-founder of Fair Vote, which is an organization that all of us at Demos have been working with for many years. Fair Vote is a nonprofit that researches and advocates election reforms that increase voter turnout, accountable governance, and fair representation. And Rob has served as the director since 1992 and is an expert on international and domestic electoral systems. National Popular Vote has been an important initiative for Fair Vote. And Rob is really going to sort of introduce the topic and help us moderate the event. I will try to keep my foot in here, too. We will then hear from Chris Pearson. Chris has been a board member of National Popular Vote since 2006. I got to know him when he was serving in the Vermont legislature in the House of Representatives from 2006 to 2008, where he was a member of the House Government Operations Committee. And we worked on some very noble and far-reaching campaign finance reform efforts, which were ultimately doomed by the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was a noble fight in any event. So we're just delighted to have him here to help explain what National Popular Vote is all about. I should also say that Chris has served as the director of the Vermont Progressive Party and has worked on the election campaigns of Congressman Bernie Sanders and Anthony Polina, who ran for governor of Vermont. And then our final speaker today, we're delighted to have Hendrick Hertzberg with us, who is a senior editor at the New Yorker magazine, where he frequently writes, as all of us know, the lead essay, the Talk of the Town column. Rick has served as President Jimmy Carter's chief speechwriter, as editor of the New Republic magazine, and as a fellow at the Institute of Politics and the Shorenstein Center for the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. He is an author, most recently, of a new book entitled Obamanos, The Birth of a New Political Era, which is a terrific title. And we're certainly delighted to have him here. I just can't resist, although I don't want to spoil the upcoming issue of the New Yorker for anyone, I happened to look at his Talk of the Town column in the most recent issue that's just been released, and I think it's so typical of his writing. It leads off with a quote from Monty Python, and then it proceeds directly to a discussion of Marcus Licinius Crassus and his exploits as recounted by Pliny the Elder and in the Lives of Plutarch. And putting all that together, of course, the topic is Mayor Michael Bloomberg. But it's just a perfect example of how delightfully erudite and unexpected his writing is and why we all enjoy it so much. And we're certainly pleased to have him here as a strong supporter of national popular vote to help explain what it's all about. So I'll turn it over to Rob, and we'll take it from there.
Try to learn from your lesson, Brenda, and not step back in my excitement here. So thank you, and thank you, Brenda, and thanks, Miles and Demos. And for those who are new to Demos, it is a terrific organization, terrific resource to the whole democracy community and other fields as well, and does great work on its own and works with others wonderfully. So glad you all can join us here. So Fair Vote has an ambitious reform agenda, and it's governed by the principle that we should respect every vote and every voice. And when you look at the current Electoral College system, it makes a heck of a lot of sense for us to work to reform it, because the current system leads campaigns to not do that in a spectacular way, really. You know, it's not just sort of a slight distortion of what candidates and campaigns do. It's an extreme, massive allocation of time, resource, and energy to a relative handful of Americans and really nothing to others. And it's easy to accept rules that we've had for a long time, and we all make things work, right? We make our democracy work as best we can. Today's election day, right? Who's voted in New York so far? Good, good. I won't shame the others yet, but good.
That will probably be the turnout, 30.
Right. And I think, obviously, I'm a big fan of voting. I'm going to rush home and vote home in Maryland, even though, once again, my city council candidate is not contested, and but I do get to vote in a race for mayor. And however, the reality is 30 to 40%, something like that. Who knows what the turnout's going to be in New York City, but it's not going to be what it was last year, right? It was November '08, the presidential race. There's a hold that the presidents in the White House have on the American people, whether it's excessive and we spend too much time, watching the West Wing and caring about the president. But the fact is, it really matters to a bunch of us. And it is an office that I think all of us being able to hold that office accountable and participate in the election of that person is important. So what's going on in the current rules is quite different. So last year, there was a pretty interesting primary process, right? And particularly on the Democratic side, Clinton and Obama were fighting it out in all 50 states and some more territories, and every contest mattered. And there was a spirit of like, okay, the whole country's part of this. We're going to maybe move into some new terrain. But after the second major party convention, the Republican convention, the last 2 months of the campaign, more than 98% of all campaign spending and more than 98% of the major party candidates for president and vice president's visits were in 15 states, representing barely a third of the American people. 98%, a third, right? So that basically 2/3 of Americans, like me in Maryland, like you in New York, a lot of us participated. We're pretty interested in the result. We needed to participate to make our states safe, but the candidates' attention was not on us. And for those of you who might have wanted to get involved and participate in that election, if they said, okay, I want to go walk a precinct or something, they said, well, let's see, let's look at a map here. Maryland, you're pretty close to Virginia. You should go to another state and try to get people there to vote, because those folks matter to us. Or if you're in New York, I don't know where, pretty long, wait, Ohio? Pretty long haul. Pennsylvania. Oh yeah, it's not that far. Right. So, you know, you go somewhere else because your neighbors' votes are taken for granted. They don't count. In 2004, there was a nice revelation from one of the pollsters for George Bush's campaign where they hadn't had to worry about a primary challenge, so they were totally focused on the general election. And for the last 2.5 years, 30 months, they didn't poll the opinions of a single person who lived outside of 18 states. So 32 states in the District of Columbia, all the people, whatever they thought, whatever interests they wanted to express, were not going to have any effect on President Bush's re-election campaign, and by the time John Kerry was running for the re-election, not on his campaign either. And that's a product of rules that are made by states that were not part of the founding generation, that were put in states for partisan parochial reasons 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the founding, in which we now take for granted because we tend to do that once we use things for a while, but we don't need to. And that's what this program is going to be about the fact that we have the power to change this, and actually it's starting to change in a very exciting way. And we have two great resources with us. Oh, well, I'm going to say one more thing, which is that I'm a big believer that this issue will win, and it also is going to have a big impact on a lot of other things that, as a democracy reformer, that I care about, and that Demos cares about, and that a lot of you probably care about, which is that once we change something that touches as many of the American people as this, we will be intrigued by what else we can do. And that's the pattern from American history, is that once something big changes, other changes happen. And whether it's an accident of timing, like 2012 might be the end of the world, but here's like the 50-year cycle. In the 1860s, we hadn't changed the Constitution for 50 years, and we suddenly changed 3 changes to the Constitution, rather important ones: ending slavery, ensuring African Americans had the right to vote, equal protection under the laws. But we also, it was a time of foment in our democracy generally, and very soon after we had the right to a secret ballot put in states, and a lot, a lot of things happened in a relatively short amount of time. 50 years later, there was another sort of silence, not much constitutional amendment change. Then we started changing the Constitution again in the 1910s. But on the democracy side, we went to direct election of U.S. senators, which we had not been doing. Women's suffrage. There was a lot of changes in the states involving more public or sort of voter access to the nomination process, the right of initiative and referendum in some states. Then things kind of quieted down again, and then in the 1960s we saw several constitutional amendments again. The people of Washington, D.C. being able to vote for president, the Voting Rights Act, ending the poll tax, and lowering the voting age to 18. But then we haven't really changed the Constitution except for one rather quirky one since then. And I think that once we realize that we're the owners of this democracy, things can happen. So national popular vote, I think, is the kind of trigger, both great in itself and important for us to think about what else that we can do. So we're going to start with Chris Pearson. And Chris, as you heard, is both a former state legislator and one of the most experienced person about talking with this among all the legislators around the country, nearly 2,000 of whom have endorsed this plan. Chris.
I appreciate that, Rob, and let me say on behalf of National Popular Vote how much we appreciate Demos taking some time and interest to learn more about what I hope you'll agree is quite an important topic. I do serve on the board of National Popular Vote, but my real function for the organization is more nitty-gritty in the streets. I have the great honor of living in Burlington, Vermont, but I travel around the East advocating for this reform. So I was there in committee hearings in New Jersey as New Jersey enacted this reform. I've been in your wonderful capital of Albany, perhaps more than I need to, and I've been in Augusta and all around, mostly the eastern part of the country. It has been fascinating to see the similarities and the differences in state legislative process around the country. As Rob said, this is something Americans have questioned and maybe taken for granted for a long, long time. But the idea of a popular vote is not a new idea at all. Gallup began asking the question of Americans how they felt about the way we elect the president as early as the 40s, and it's consistently had about 70% support among the general public for a popular vote for president. What is unusual about our reform, national popular vote, is that people were not focused on the fact that, can you hear me in the back? Is that right? We're not focused on the fact that states had the power to award electors any way they like. So the founders created an electoral college. They created a numeric formula to allocate electors to every state based on their number of members of Congress and the Senate, and that was it. They left the way it would function entirely up to the states. This was very in keeping with their principle of spreading power out, having a lot of checks and balances. In this case, the rules of how electors are awarded being left up to each individual state. So a lot of people, when I start talking to them about this project in the legislature, will say, oh, no, we can't mess with what the founders intended. And I think that's very important to start right there, because in fact national popular vote as a bill and as an idea is exactly what the founders intended. They did leave this question up to the states, and as Rob said, since 2/3 of the states are effectively locked out of a presidential election, what could be more appropriate than the states embracing a state power and coming together to fix this problem? The Supreme Court has called it a plenary power belonging to the states. And just as illustration, in the first presidential election in our history, 3 states used the winner-take-all rule, which is what New York and 48 states use today. Even today, though, Maine and Nebraska use a congressional district model. The first presidential election, only 5 states actually let people vote for president at all. And states made that change. There was certainly an enormous change to the way we elect the president. Had no need or infringement on the Constitution, no need to change the Constitution, just state law to let people vote. Gradually, over decades, the current process as we know it today came to shape. But Massachusetts, for example, has changed its awarding of electors 10 times. They've switched back and forth. Some states had presidential elector districts. There's just been any number of ways. I often say, you know, in Maine, you could say if you want the 4 tallest people in Maine will be your presidential elector. And you could do that. I don't know why you would do that, but you could do that. The Constitution is just carte blanche for states. So because 2/3 of the states are locked out, because at least 2/3 of the money in 08, for example, went to 6 states, we have increasing policy problems that are impacted by the way we elect the president. Think Cuban immigration's been a hot topic of debate in this country for decades. Not really something you hear about on the streets, but very important in Florida. So it becomes our national dialogue. There's on, and Rick will talk more about some of that. But because of these problems, states are looking to solve this and create a popular vote for president. We do not need to eliminate the Electoral College to get there. Because states have exclusive power over how to award their electors, they're embracing this power and coming together. Our bill has already been enacted by 5 states. Those states possess 61 electors. That's about almost a quarter towards 270 electors. Our bill is triggered by states that represent 270 electors participating. And it works this way. New York, right now, you have a winner-take-all rule. If you get the most votes in the state of New York, you get all 31 of your electors. The bill that's pending in Albany today says, the National Popular Votes bill says, rather than give its 31 electors to the candidate gets the most votes in the state, New York is going to give its electors to the candidate gets the most votes in the whole country. Okay? But you wouldn't want to do that on your own. That would be, you'd be giving something away. So the bill says there's a trigger, and this trigger doesn't take effect. The bill doesn't go into effect until enough other states have joined you around the country, till a majority of the electoral votes are involved in this agreement. So states are using an agreement between themselves, a contract between states, to form a PAC. And this grouping of electors has to have a majority of the Electoral College in it. Okay? At that point, it's probably going to be 20, 25 states. When we reach that point, when a majority of the Electoral College is part of this agreement, it doesn't matter which states have signed the agreement, because they're all saying that the votes, their electors, are going to go not to the results of those 20 states or those individual states, but to the person that gets the most votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. When you're going to have a spreadsheet on election night with 51 lines on it, and the candidate at the bottom with the biggest total is going to get this block of 270 electors. And in that way, they're going to be guaranteed to go to the White House. Does that make sense? Because people who think about this a lot need it. Let me try once more. So states can do anything they want with their electors. We're asking them to come together and form a super pool of electoral votes, a majority of the Electoral College. In order to win the presidency, you need to win a majority of votes in the Electoral College. That's at least 270 votes. So when states have all agreed, so when not all states, excuse me, when enough states have passed our bill that they have a block of at least 270 electors, this bill takes effect. And at that point, we're going to run a campaign. We're going to run a campaign in all 50 states. Every vote will be equal. And when you get the most votes in the whole country, in all 50 states, you're going to be guaranteed to get this chunk, this block of a majority of the Electoral College, thanks to the National Popular Vote Bill. At that point, you go to the White House, candidate gets the most votes, wins. Can we interrupt? Just you have a puzzled look. You want to try again?
No, what's the difference between what's going on now? I don't really understand that difference.
There's a question between what goes on now. I'll take a moment. The way it works today.
I know, but I don't see how this changes anything. You're still giving everybody electoral votes.
We still have the electoral
votes at all.
Well, states can't eliminate. The question is, why do we even have the Electoral College? And isn't that what we have today? We will still have the Electoral College. States cannot eliminate the Electoral College. That would require a constitutional amendment. But the way the Electoral College works is entirely up to states. And so if we want to arrive at a popular vote for president, which is something 70 to 80% of the American public likes, and for any number of reasons is important, then the way states can do that is by fixing the way the Electoral College works, or changes the way it works. Right now, the Electoral College is a rubber stamp in each state, okay? Or 2 little rubber stamps in Maine and 3 in Nebraska. But it is a rubber stamp in that it doesn't surprise us. It just ratifies what happens in a particular jurisdiction. So Democrat wins New York, boom, the Electoral College goes for the Democrat in New York. Does that make sense? We're making it one big rubber stamp for the country. Get the most votes in the country, boom. You're going to win the Electoral College. You're guaranteed to go to the White House. And at that point, we do have a system where we're adhering to the one person, one vote principle, where every vote is equal, where we're not going to care necessarily about a vote in Dayton, Ohio, or Cleveland, Ohio, or Fort Lauderdale. Those are not going to have extra super value compared to the rest of our votes. Yeah.
Yeah, I keep thinking of something my mother used to always say, which was, "This sounds too clever by half." And what I'm thinking is, why wouldn't one just have a proposal to allocate appropriate proportionality within the state as the most direct way to do it? Because this thing says, okay, my state goes 99% for X, and the rest of the country goes 51% for Y. My state votes don't count anymore. We have to give them to Y.
We're going to definitely take questions, and I think we should get through the remarks. Does that make sense? And the nugget answer to your question is that electors are people, and you can't have 53% of a person voting one way. You know, so there are. I'll be happy to address that later. The point is that we have a constitutional, legal, politically practical way to fix the Electoral College. This now has been introduced. We have sponsors in all 50 states. We've been at this for 3.5 years. I mentioned it. We've enacted it in 5 states: Hawaii, Washington, Illinois, New Jersey, and Maryland. Those states have a total of 61 electors, which is 23% of our we need 270. We're 23% of the way there. We have now passed 29 chambers in a total of 19 states. If we had 19 states on board, this room, we wouldn't be able to hold this discussion in this room. This would be a very, very major part of our political discussion in this country. We are attempting to build what I think is a very, very exciting movement towards a major shift in our election and democratic process. And let me just say that this is, Rob touched on this very quickly, but it's important that people recognize how consistent this is with major reforms that have happened in our past. People sort of think, as you perhaps are suggesting, that we found a cute way to get around a problem, and maybe it's a little shifty the way we're doing it. In fact, if you look at, as I mentioned, states were the ones that actually let people vote for president. We don't have a right to vote for president in the United States Constitution. States were the parties, the bodies that removed the property requirement as an impairment to vote, that let women vote. The women's suffrage movement is particularly indicative. They spent a lot of time arguing in Congress for a constitutional amendment to let women vote. And finally, after decades, there was a split in that movement. And the movement that split off said, we endorse what you're doing in Washington, and we're headed to state capitals. And that very year, 1869, Wyoming was the first state to let women vote for president, or period, let women vote. By the time the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, 30 states had let women vote. And the constitutional amendment did pass at that point, but it extended the practice to the rest of the states. The white guys in Congress didn't pass the 19th Amendment out of the goodness of their heart. Most of them were elected by women, and the rest of them could see the train coming in state capitol. Direct election of senator, letting African Americans vote, letting 18-year-olds vote. All of these changes have come through action in the states. In some cases, they've resulted in a constitutional amendment. But the point is that states, this is a very, very appropriate, and because states are the aggrieved party in the presidential election today, I believe the absolutely appropriate method for making this important change. I look forward to questions, and we'll talk about some of the, that's kind of the nuts and bolts. Let's hear from some of the more interesting reasons why this is so important. Rick.
Thanks. I'll try to make this quick, because I've found in sessions like this that the best part is always when we start talking about it. And I want to say to you and to you that it took 4 times, four lengthy explanations with increasing impatience for me to get my mind around what this actually is. And when I got my mind around it, it was a conversion experience. It was the road to Damascus. And I have devoted, since this was announced, this idea, this nutty idea, I guess it was 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, I've devoted all of my kind of civic spare time to this and to other aspects of electoral reform through Fair Vote, but especially to this. This is something that can happen. This is not a pipe dream. This can really, really happen. It could conceivably happen by the time of the next election. It has a very good chance of happening by the time of the election after that. And I just ask you, those of you who have gotten your mind around it, project into the future and look at the 2016 election night when the results are coming in. We will be having a national election for the first time in American history. We've never had a national election, ever. We won't be looking at a map of states. States are a category that will be important insofar as they are important to human beings, to people. I don't know about you, but to me, it's very nice. I live in New York State. I like New York State, but New York State is not very high on the list of my identities, the things that are important to me. I don't think first, well, when I'm going to vote for president, I don't think, how's my vote going to serve the parochial interests of New York State? I'm thinking nationally when I'm thinking about voting for president. When I vote for senator, yes, or when I vote for governor, certainly, then I'm thinking about the parochial interest, but not when I vote for president. This reform will do two enormous things. One, it will prevent the wrong winner from winning the presidency. Now, this is something that happens not terribly often. Well, it's only happened 4 times in American history. It's only happened once since we became a more or less mature democracy. So that's a 1 in 14 failure rate, which is, that's pretty good in some ways. It wouldn't be so good in the case of open heart surgery, maybe. But if you look at the close elections, if you look at elections that aren't landslides, then it's a 1 in 7 failure rate. We can expect 1 election out of 7 close elections to be decided the wrong way, if indeed you think it's wrong for candidate A to get fewer votes than candidate B, and then candidate B to be made president. I think that's wrong. I think it violates a very elementary principle of democracy, and I don't see why we should tolerate it. But that's not the most important thing this reform will do. This reform will transform and energize American politics from top to bottom. Right now, the system of spectator states and battleground states, a few battleground states, the vast majority spectator states, means that grassroots politics is not worth doing in 90% of the country. It's just not worth doing. If you want to be in, if you're a resident of New York State and you want to campaign for your help out in a presidential election, it would be nice if you could have a coffee clutch and invite in your neighbors, talk about the campaign, see if you could persuade a few of them to change their vote. That would be a really stupid thing to do in most of the country, or almost all of the country, in 45 states minimum, because it won't make any difference. It can't have any impact. It doesn't matter which side you're on. Why can this happen? Once it happens, then every vote will be worth going after. Every vote, no matter where it is geographically, will be worth going after. And the reason I think this can happen in a practical sense is because the people who will make it happen are state legislators, state politicians. The politicians in 3/4 or more of the country are nobody in a general election. If you're in a spectator state and you're a politician, you're a state legislator, forget about having your calls returned from a national campaign. They're not interested. This would empower politicians, because it will directly empower voters in these one-sided spectator states. Their votes, an extra vote for a Democrat in New York, or for a Republican in New York, or for a Democrat in Texas, or a Republican in Texas, will be just as much worth going for as a vote on either side, as a vote for the winner in a place like West Virginia or Florida. And because the presidency, as Rob pointed out, that's where our emotions are most, and our feelings and our citizenship are most engaged, because that involvement, because of the tremendous increase in grassroots politics that this reform will bring about, it's going to energize politics all the way down the line, right down to aldermen. And that's the most important part of this. It's going to make organizing, grassroots politics, citizen involvement, it's going to make it more valuable compared to media, money, all of that. It's going to make door-to-door, person-to-person one by one, political organizing through the whole country, the lingua franca, and it's going to reduce the influence of money and media. So I really implore you to imagine what the country will be like when we have this reform in place, when we have a real national election fought out on real national issues, what that's going to be like for this country. I think it'll be a wonderful thing, and it will be in the interest of these state legislators doesn't matter whether they're in the minority in a given state or the majority in a given state, it's in their self-interest to do this. And that's why I think as a practical matter, this can be done, this can happen. So maybe first we should clear up those of you who haven't got your head around it yet. You were wondering about this. That's the end of my little talk. Okay. But I want to address what you suggested. Why not do it proportionally, state by state? Well, partly for the reason earlier mentioned the main reason is that you would have to get every single state to agree to do that for it to be in the interest of any one state. A state qua state, it's in the interest of a state qua state to maximize its clout. And the way you do that is by giving all your votes to one candidate, the candidate of the party that happens to be in control in that state. If you go for dividing it proportionally in your state, then you disarm your state compared to other states. And you can't have everybody do that unless everybody agrees to do it. And if you need all 50 states to agree to something, you might as well just amend the Constitution. I'd also like to say, though, that the Electoral College was conceived in sin. The idea of a popular vote was not a strange idea to the framers. They understood that idea. They knew it was done in many, many states to elect governors. And the main reason that they didn't do it was because, and this is admitted by Madison. Madison was was passionately in favor of, well, he was passionately in favor of having having proportional senators, having the big states get more senators and the small states get fewer. But he also liked the idea of popular vote. But he admitted during the fight over the ratification that the reason it hadn't flown was because the Electoral College scheme imports the 3/5 rule favoring the slave owners into the presidential election. That's why we got it.
You just told me I wasted 25 years of my life.
Doing what? Campaigning for New York?
New York, I've gone to many states for president, including Sarasota, and West Palm Beach, and New York, and Pennsylvania, getting out the votes.
Yes, you've gone to battleground. No, you haven't. Not at all. Not at all. You did you did the only thing a person trying to influence a presidential election can do. You avoided most of the country. You went and focused your energies on a few geographic locations where a relatively small number of votes could tip a large number of electoral votes. That's rational. That's your civic duty. You've been doing your civic duty for 25 years. But wouldn't it be nice if you could stay home and do your civic duty?
No. That wouldn't be my civic duty, would it?
Yes, it would.
It wouldn't be my constitutional responsibility.
Sure it would.
No.
And why wouldn't it be your constitutional responsibility?
I wouldn't be a functioning American citizen.
Yes, you would.
I would be a parasite. I'd be depending on something that I don't even grasp.
You mean you don't understand what this plan is?
I just want my vote to count. I want a popular vote. I want my vote to count as my vote. Not something electoral person. Is it a person?
Yeah.
Well, I don't see the person. Is it my congressman?
No. Could be.
I know. Well, it could be a lot of things, but it's not my choice.
What state do you live in?
Manhattan.
You live in Manhattan, I see, yeah. Yeah, why don't you...
We will sort of get back to that question, but I think let's take a few questions. I see a number of hands that are up here.
Okay.
I'm Marjorie Shea with the League of Women Voters, who has been studying this topic for at least 2 years. League of Women Voters, New York City, has done a study of this, and the League of Women Voters is for popular vote, direct popular vote for president. However, the National League would have us do an amendment to the Constitution, which, as you know, has been tried several times, most recently in the 1970s with Birch Bayh and so forth. It has not worked. Now, what you're proposing in NPV is an end run around that blockage. And it's a good idea. It's an intriguing idea. However, people do not trust the interstate compact part of that. We've just seen our governor rating an interstate compact fund, the Ritchie Fund for greenhouse gases. They don't trust that an interstate compact would work.
I'm happy to address that. The legal mechanism for a state to work together with another state is called an interstate compact. It's a contract between states. There are hundreds of compacts in this country. Probably the most famous one you might be familiar with is the New York-New Jersey Port Authority. That is an agreement between two states that's hashed out through a legislative process that forms an interstate compact. The Powerball is an interstate compact. In my state of Vermont, we have border towns that send kids to New Hampshire schools. Those towns have an interstate compact. It is just simply a contract between states. It means that the language has to be exactly the same in every state, in every party that signs the contract, and it is subject to the impairments clause of the United States Constitution. So just like we don't worry that New York is actually going to allocate its 30-odd electors to the candidate gets the most votes in the country, in the state, you know that's going to happen because that's state law. That's state law today. It would be impossible, really, for the Secretary of State or the governor, whoever certifies the election, to do it in a way that was counter to state law. The National Popular Vote bill is an interstate compact that is state law. When it goes into effect, New Jersey has already said that it will participate in this contract. It's a contractual agreement, like many, that has a way to get out of the contract, but you can't just willy-nilly get out of it. So it's pretty well accepted as it's not a controversial tool, let's say. Our book, which is available for free at the back, Every Vote Equal, is authored by several people, including a guy named Joseph Zimmerman. He is a SUNY Albany professor and considered perhaps the national leader on the topics of interstate compacts. There's no prohibition on what they can cover and so forth. So I hope that helps.
Let me just very quickly address one part of this thread, because I've been hearing a couple of people expressing support for just a direct election constitutional amendment, which is where we got into this, because back in the 90s, we were saying, right, we're going to take on this problem, direct election for president. That was the historic way, not historic, but the most recent 30, 40 years perspective of how to move forward. But it's not only really hard to do, I don't think anyone really knows what it should even look like right now. What the language of that constitutional amendment should be is a very important conversation. It's really hard to change the Constitution. So if you don't get it right, we sort of messed up on prohibition, and then we had to go back, and then we undid it. But very rarely do we refine something. Actually, the Electoral College was refined with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. There was some screwy aspects of the original way we did the Electoral College, so they had to fix it you know. But right now, there's actually no real lifting, including from the legal women voters, unfortunately, on language for what that direct election amendment should be. In the meantime, here is a proposal that will absolutely guarantee that whoever gets the most popular votes in all 50 states and D.C. will win a majority of the Electoral College in the presidency. And that's the goal that most people are seeking when they seek a constitutional amendment. And here's a policy proposal that states have the power to act on. And I should say this and sort of emphasize a point that we've both made, or all of us have made, I think, in one form or another, but that the winner-take-all rule, which is behind what the problem here, right, the fact that states give all their electoral votes to one candidate, and that's what leads most candidates, you know, the candidates to ignore most states, that wasn't what we did in the 1790s. And the reason we moved to it was very partisan and very parochial and helping one side versus another. And once a certain number of states do it, you're coerced into doing it. Like Nebraska does do it by congressional district, but that means that the Republicans that generally run Nebraska are kind of upset right now because their state gave one electoral vote to Barack Obama, and the Republican Party just said that's one of their priorities is to get rid of the system and go to a winner-take-all rule because they want to maximize their help because no one else is doing it that way, right? So that what we're changing isn't the founders' vision of democracy. So when you talk about an end run around the Constitution, it's actually changing something that isn't the Constitution. It's changing a state statute to do the winner-take-all rule that wasn't in the Constitution and wasn't part of the Electoral College early on. It became that way. So it's sort of a mindset. It's an education issue in part because we don't know a lot of this stuff. I didn't know this stuff, right? And then you'd sort of learn about our history and our political history, and then the powers that actually we have to change it, and that's where the road to this proposal becomes pretty straightforward. We have several questions here. Shall we take like 2 or 3 questions?
Can I just say that quickly, because Birch Bai is part of our, he's an advisor on our, and I'm sorry? Well, his father, Senator Birch Bai, is part of our advisory committee. He supported your efforts, as is John Anderson and Buchanan. Several people from that era are helping us now. But the idea that this is an end run and that that's not appropriate, I mean, were states not appropriate to grant women the right to vote? I mean, they were using the the power given to them by the Constitution. Were states not appropriate when they let people vote for president? That was a big change in the process. So I do take issue with the idea this is inappropriate.
And let's pick maybe like 2 or 3 questions and see if we can weave them together. So Chris, you have some point to
Sure, right there.
Hi, my name is Corinne Carey, and I'm Public Policy Counsel with the New York Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU has been studying this issue. We've been asked with affiliate what is our position on the bill that's currently in Albany. And I'm trying to, I think my head is around how this is going to work. What I can't really figure out is how to answer some of these tough questions. And I haven't heard good answers to the tough questions that have been asked so far. And the 2 that I'll pose, and honestly, this is just so that I can, if
Absolutely.
you take a position, I want to know how to answer. It seems to me that, and some would argue that the Electoral College is in place to balance out the voices of those in smaller, lesser populated states. That if you had a system where, for example, if you had the system that you're talking about, in the beginning you talked about politicians visiting Florida and not visiting New York. Well, you'd have the opposite problem where politicians would only go to places that have big populations. So the smaller states would lose out on that presidential candidate tour. And so I want to try to understand, one, how this doesn't disadvantage the smaller populated states,
Sure.
how they would even have a voice if this interstate compact went into effect. And then how do you get the politicians then to visit places that are sparsely populated?
I think
Should we take 2 other questions and then
Okay.
we flag this? And then
Yeah, sir, Richard.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm Tom DeLuca from Fordham University. Hi, Judy. How you doing? I just wanted to say that I believe this is a brilliant idea. And I also think if it ever really gained a lot of momentum and traction, it would be much more likely that the Constitution would be amended to actually abolish the Electoral College. I don't think there would be a problem coming up with language. I think we could come up with language this afternoon. Many people have done it over the years. I don't think that's the issue. And I do think we're changing what the founders did. I mean, that's the whole point of this. They did not want direct election of the president. We want that. And so I think that if you can imagine 15 or 16 states, or this getting close to the end point, I think we might get to the point where actually the fact that this would in fact override the Electoral College might create political momentum to seriously consider just changing the Constitution. It's only been done 27 times in our history, and over 10,000 attempts have been made. So it's a very, very difficult thing. And just on your point, I mean, small states that are not battleground states are ignored today. What this would change is over-representing them as they are now in the Electoral College and give them fair representation.
Right here.
I'm Teresa Hummel from Community Church of New York, Task Force on Election Integrity. I feel like there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room which nobody is acknowledging, which is the national infrastructure for electronic cheating. We have over a dozen states that have inauditable electronic touchscreen style voting machines where the vote tallies are unknown to anybody in the state or any voter. And we also have other states that have equipment that can be audited but is not audited. And the ability to shift a few votes per precinct can easily shift several million votes across the country, which would not be detectable and cannot be challenged at the local or state level. So even if a certain number of states would make this pact to go with the national vote, as reported by these states, states that are not part of the pact, such as Georgia, Ohio, and other states where we've already seen a suspected internationally suspected shift of votes, for example, in the Max Cleland election in 2002, and as perhaps some of you heard of the movie Stealing America Vote by Vote, which showed all of the evidence of the man in the middle switching of, it's a particular type of computer tactic to switch votes that occurred in Ohio in 2004 and which was in place in 2008 in 8 states, which was dismantled as a result of a last-minute lawsuit followed by a suspicious death of the man who was involved in a plane crash a month later. So we have these suspicions nationwide of that infrastructure, and this plan kind of plays into it and gives that infrastructure, if there is one, and if it is activated and used in that way, gives that the ability to control the national popular vote and force states to put their electoral votes into a non-winner.
Thank you.
Why don't Chris, you want to deal with the vote count issue, and Rick, you can deal with the small state issue?
Whatever. Okay. Does that make sense? Sure. The election integrity issue is, we hear it from time to time, and I think you could not say that it's much more important than the basic fundamental principle of I check this box and my vote counts for that candidate. So I don't see them as being in opposition at all. National popular vote doesn't try to solve every election problem or concern we have. Right now, basically you're talking about fraudulent elections. And it is one way to look at it. There's a lot of nefarious things that happen around elections. Think of voter suppression in Florida, well recorded in 2000 and 2004. You have some machine placement issues in Ohio in 2004 in particular. Ohio settled the election. John Kerry switched 60,000 votes in Ohio, he would have won. He trailed by Bush. He trailed Bush by 3.5 million votes around the country.
In a reported vote count, which may have been tainted by...
Absolutely, but the point is that if I'm devious in my designs on the presidential election, and I have the mechanics of using voting machines to enact my devious intentions, I know right where to go. And right now I go to Ohio and I go to Florida and I fabricate or diminish whatever votes. We had reports of sheriffs standing online in Florida listening to people announce their name. That's a clear voter suppression. That has an incredible impact on the outcome of the national election because of what happens in Florida. It's got an oversized influence because Florida is so important. If you fabricate 50,000 votes in Ohio today, you can turn the election. If you have one giant pool of national popular vote for president, you have 130 million voters, and you influence 50,000 votes in Ohio, the chances are that that's not going to, in fact, have an enormous, as weighty an impact. So I would argue, and it's been argued on Congress.
You're not really addressing what I said, which is that there's a national infrastructure in all states, and there are more than a dozen states where there is no...
Sure. I mean, I don't know how to address that. I don't work on election integrity issues. I work on a different kind of reform that doesn't take away from your effort, and it doesn't negate it either. I mean, I think that these are both important issues.
It makes the outcome more vulnerable to that type of tampering.
Well, that's where I disagree. I think today we're more vulnerable to the outcome because it can happen in specific locations and have a dramatic impact on the election, whereas if you're throwing it into a pool of 130 million voters, I think you bring down the impact.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It's just a lot. The smaller the constituency, the easier it is to steal, and you can flip 50 electoral votes with by stealing a few thousand popular votes, but you cannot. But it's statistically, if you're a statistician, which I'm not, but it is much harder for an election to get within stealing distance if it's 130 million voters than if it's a million voters. Yeah. On this question of the founders of the small states, actually 13 of the 14 smallest states right now are spectator states. What the system as it operates does is not to privilege smaller states, but to privilege battleground states. And there's also a kind of ethical or political question in my mind. What national popular vote will do is to make votes equally valuable no matter where they are cast. I don't see any reason why why votes in small states should be accorded greater weight than votes in large states. That seems a highly irrational way to accord greater weight to votes. And our system makes ample provision for protecting the interests of small states qua states. What did you...
Just not a candidate that's popular.
Campaigning in the big population centers and such.
Not only be campaigning, but they'll also, and this is from somebody who's progressive, so I am playing the devil's advocate a little bit, that you've got candidates then who would necessarily win, who would play to, those urban centers, those population centers that are progressive, then what chance do the people in the middle, who may not agree with those of us on the left, and, those of us on the coast? Maybe I'm not making sense, but this is a criticism I hear, and I try to figure out how to respond to that. So not only are people being visited by the candidates in the large population areas, but they also cater to a certain type of voter, and that's not the voter from Wyoming. I'm just thinking a state out of it.
Only because Wyoming is not a swing state, but they do cater to you if you're in West Virginia. If what you were saying, if this notion that all the energy will be focused on big population centers were true, then Coca-Cola would only advertise in big population centers. It's a question of cost per thousand. If you want to get another 1,000 votes, you can pick them up in Alaska or Wyoming. It doesn't matter where you go for them. You can get. It's not going to be any. There will be no advantage to distorting your efforts as a campaign beyond the proportionality of the population. If you see what I mean.
Chris wants to add something, and I'll just say very quickly two things. One is we have a lot of experience with popular vote elections because we do them for everything else. So it's not, we're not talking about theory, we're talking about something we're very experienced in. Today there's a popular vote for mayor of New York, right? There's a popular vote for governor of New Jersey. Corzine and Christie and Daggett are fighting it out in New Jersey. Almost certainly they ID'd voters anywhere they might vote. They did some work phoning them, maybe did some doorbelling if they were doing particularly good grassroots work. They find them, and then you're reminding them to vote today, right? And you don't do that just in Newark, or you want to get your people out to vote. And I want to emphasize that absolute distinction, though, in the current system where when the winner-take-all rule means most states don't matter, they do nothing, right? And it's nothing like that. So Hillary Clinton in 2000, she spent most of her time campaigning upstate, right? Because not because most of the votes were there, but because she felt she might have more of an impact there. Even though she lost upstate, she still mattered, she could find some votes, right? So we know what popular votes are like, and they're not what people, I think, fear. Mathematically, like if you look at Ronald Reagan's election in 1984, he got 5% of the vote in D.C., right? He wasn't particularly popular among African Americans. He got almost 60% of the national popular vote, right? You can win the national popular vote without necessarily carrying the big cities, because there's a whole lot of Americans everywhere. You can win every single vote, which you're not going to do, but you can win every single vote cast in like the 5 biggest population states. You're nowhere near 50%. Right? You've got to win votes everywhere, and that's sort of the math of what it takes to win in a national popular vote.
And you know, it's tough because we think of this in terms of red states and blue states, and how will one state go versus another state. Under a popular vote, you're not going to have that map anymore, and it becomes all about margins. So the 2004 election, which was more of a standard election than 2008, the Bush margin coming out of Texas and Florida was almost 2 million votes. The Kerry margin coming out of New York and California was about 2 million votes. So we sort of tend to balance ourselves out, and it does become about margins. When we passed this bill in the Vermont House, and it was later vetoed, unfortunately, when we passed the bill, someone stood up and said, why would we give away our influence in the Electoral College? We're a small state. And someone else stood up and rather dryly asked, how could we possibly have any less influence? Is that physically possible? And people laughed, and that idea carried the day. What happened today is 2/3 of the states are forcibly excluded. When they're thinking of doing a poll, they exclude New York, they exclude my little state of Vermont, they exclude Rhode Island and Maine and the Dakotas and Wyoming. They are excluded from mailings, from polls, from campaign visits. If you are doing a poll under national popular vote, Vermont's going to be in there. We don't have a lot of phone numbers, so we're not going to have an overwhelming influence on the poll, but we're not going to be excluded. When you're running for governor in Vermont, you don't spend all of your time in the most rural regions, but they do have mailboxes there, and you do send them a piece of mail. And actually, TV advertising per viewer is cheaper in my town of Burlington, Vermont, than it is here in Manhattan, per viewer. So it's going to be cheaper, in fact, to advertise in rural areas. And that's why now we have 8 chambers in the very smallest states, either 2 or 3 or 4 electoral votes that have passed our bill. So small states are standing up and saying, hey, this system is not working for us.
Let's take 2 or 3 more questions here.
My name is Madeline Ehrlich. I'm from the Roosevelt Institute, and and so I sort of have 2 parts. The first is, have you encountered any significant opposition? I haven't really heard about any yet. And the second is, because the plan is constitutional and legal and seems to have a great deal of public support, do you anticipate any contestation in the first election if this plan were used, perhaps from a state that didn't vote for it?
Any other questions to add to that? Yes. Secretary on the right.
Thank you. Ulrich Bluk is a voter. I support your plan, but I also want to play devil's advocate. One thing is, I'm sure there will be disappointments. I'm primarily asking about unintended consequences. There will be disappointments. I could imagine that a state will say legislators will be disappointed and they'll vote down their previous approval of the plan. And that would be very bad, I think, for your project. Have you tried to do something about that? The second thing is, the emphasis was here on grassroots. I hope you're right, and I just like what you said, that small states, it's cheaper to advertise there, to look for votes. But I could imagine, because of all the huge amounts of monies that we are floating around in elections, so lobbying, which to my mind is actually the most important problem why our vote is not fair. We just have an election today where that's playing and money is playing a huge role. I could imagine that the whole campaign will shift because of limits on resources. For example, the presidential candidates already spend all the time they possibly can. You cannot send them to more places than they are going to now. So that's not going to happen. Perhaps the whole thing might go toward more debates, toward more television advertising, and less grassroots. Thank you.
Let's take one more question, though. There was 4 good issues but I flagged them here. But let's take, I guess, one more question, and then we'll tackle those.
Thank you. My question is a curiosity one. Rob mentioned the word education. And I'm wondering how, when you go around publicizing or advocating for this change, the knowledge of the populace that the states, in fact, vote for the president, that it's not the one person. Also, the awareness that it's a canard that we live in a one person, one vote kind of a democracy. This young lady's question in terms of the small states, Nebraska, giving up their power. All of this seems to me a matter of just educating the public on the reality, or the populace, on the reality of what our democracy was about. And I'm glad you mentioned with the Founding Fathers, it seemed to be that the whole idea was to ensure that the majority did not rule. If it was only white males with property, if it was only those in the important states, and as states were added, it was always about playing out, not losing power, you know, through each one of the compromises. So I'm just curious in terms of how the dynamic, certainly for what you're doing, but how the dynamic plays out when you interact with the public in terms of the education and overcoming some of their misunderstandings.
Great set of questions here. Why don't we, I was thinking Rick could maybe talk about the money and grassroots issue, and then I thought the others in some ways, I can reel them off for you, Rick, but they, or Chris, but they seem kind of national popular vote focused, so I'll turn to Rick.
It's impossible, this is time.
Oh, did I turn you off?
It's impossible. There's no way that presidential campaigns are not raising absolutely as much money as they can right now. It's not as if they will be magically empowered to raise more money just because of this change. So the money that they do raise is going to be spread more thinly. The one resource that there are no controls over is people in their own communities. That's where, that's the part that's going to increase under a national popular vote. That's where, so relatively speaking, grassroots activity is going to become more important than it is now, and more important in relation to the role of money and media. Right now, all that money is being funneled into a few marginal areas where its impact is maximized. You can't. That's another thing that will stop happening. That'll have to. The money is going to end up spread a lot more evenly, and there's going to be a lot more grassroots activity everywhere.
And just to add one quick point to that, which is that it's a long-term change I think we are likely to see as well. Because there was a debate within the Democratic Party about the 50-state strategy, right? Howard Dean talked about how he wanted to build a party in places that were strong for Republicans, but it was good to have a Democratic presence. Newt Gingrich is actually talking about that same point. He thinks it's good, the Republicans should try to get back in New England and should try to be in more places. But in real terms, when you come down to presidential elections, they don't do that. And that's the time when there's sort of the greatest participation, the greatest money flowing, and it's only going to certain states. And it happened with Barack Obama as well. He really, at the end of the day, just focused on 15 states. But if you, over time, need to have your side get people out to vote, you really need to start playing there all the time. you need to start getting your message out, building your brand identity for your side. So that I think that the sense of a long-term building of the infrastructure that supports people voting for you. I mean, there'll be the partisans will have an interest to do that. That's different from now. Because you could do a whole lot of that in Pennsylvania, but Pennsylvania is actually right on the edge right now of not being a battleground. And once you tip over that edge, it's like falling off a cliff. You know, then as far as the attention of the nation on what you do there. But if it's always going to matter, it's different. So I'll turn it to Chris for several questions. And what I had, Chris, was I had what's some of the opposition like? What are conditions relating to withdrawal, like if states start coming out of it, potential legal issues that might come up, and efforts for education of the public about the issue and how the public is responding.
We're covering a lot of good ground. Let's see. Our opponents, the Cato Institute is against us for reasons that are a little hard to make clear. They generally sort of are supportive of the idea of federalism, which I've always understood to be the balance of power between the states and the federal government. And it's hard to see how using a state power to change an election law really tilts that. Nevertheless, that's where they're coming from. There is an organization that's just starting to get ground called Save Our States, out of sort of, we believe, kind of a right-wing think tank brainchild, but they're kind of quiet. You know, I should say that the public support, we did a poll 2 weeks ago in West Virginia, 81% of the public supports it there. And we've done them in big states, little states, blue, red, battleground, you name it, north, south, and it's always consistent. It's a little stronger among Democrats, but a solid majority of Republican voters too. This gentleman asked about states withdrawing. What happens? You can't, if a state passes it and then later on they want to get out of it. You cannot bind future state legislatures, so we don't have any choice there. However, the Interstate Compact, which is what New Jersey, Maryland, and others, and we're asking people to pass, is a contract, as we've discussed, and it has a way to get out of it. You cannot get out of it in the last 6 months of a presidential term. There's a blackout period there to avoid hanky-panky around between the nomination date and the inauguration date. We don't want anyone to try some backdoor weird game that could alter the outcome of the election. So it's ironclad. You can withdraw any time, but it will not take effect in that last 6 months. Politically, it's hard to see how a legislator says, I don't like the idea of a popular vote, even though 75% of my constituents like it, and I want to undo this. But of course, that is their priority. And should we be at the 270 threshold and see a national popular vote, and for some reason it didn't go well, 1 or 2 states could drop out of it, and if we were below the 270 threshold again, we would be right where we are now, which is waiting for more states. Politically, it's hard, again, to see us reverting from that, but that is definitely a possibility. I do think you're likely to see some kind of legal challenge. We've had teams of lawyers, including a Supreme Court litigator, be part of the drafting of this agreement. So we're ready, I guess, is the best way to say it. But yeah, this is a litigious society, and we do anticipate that. I want to talk about, there was one question about a concentration of visits, or it's been the theme here. You see them, aren't they? They're limited time. People can only be in so many places at one time. We're seeing today an enormous concentration. We talked about the smallest states. There's 13 of the absolute smallest states. Only New Hampshire's been in play lately, in the last 30 plus years. The 12 remaining small states have 11 million people, and they have 40 electors. There happen to be 11 million people in Ohio, and they have a meager 20 electoral votes. Those 11 million people in Ohio, in the last 2 months of the presidential election of 08, got over 60 visits from presidential candidate. The 11 million people living in the very smallest states got 0. Absolutely none. So they won't go to Ohio 60 times. I'm quite confident of that in the general election. They will go all over the country. You know, it's going to be, the candidates will be much more spread out. But I think that the point that Rick makes is that it's not going to be just about where is the candidate. It's going to be where are the voters and where are the American people that want to get engaged in a presidential election that they've been kind of observing from the bleachers while we watch Florida and Ohio in center field. Suddenly we're going to have just one big giant level playing field.
Let me just say briefly on the point about public education and public response. I find that people love to talk about this issue. We're all, in a sense, experts to at least some degree on presidential elections. I have 3 kids in school, talk to their classes, and kids have strong opinions about the Electoral College, certainly by the time they're in 6th or 7th grade, right? And actually a lot of the state legislators will sort of make that point. I kind of figured this out when I was 12, and I think I'm on your side. But there's a lot of things people don't know about the current system. They certainly don't know a lot about this proposal yet. And I think that the National Popular Vote has done an exciting, remarkable effort working with state legislators who really, in some ways, are the direct constituency here. It's their constitutional authority and responsibility to deal with it. But the broader public conversation, I think, will need to happen and will happen as this gets closer. But I think that that's where more civic community, women voters, other groups have a role to play. And they'll have a ready audience. I think people will be interested in talking about it, but the level of understanding of a lot of the particular rules, I think, isn't as high as we sometimes think. Yes, we got, let's go you and then the gentleman behind you and then the gentleman there.
With this blackout period, 6 months before, we've gone through this whole effective change. Now we're having presidential primaries in January and so forth, and we might even have them in December because a number of states have floated with that. So let's hypothetically assume Obama did not run, and it was Hillary Clinton, and she locked up the Democratic nomination by February. Might this not convince some states to withdraw from the compact, who would be against her? So shouldn't your blackout period basically be a year before, extended to a year before?
Well, okay, should we have...
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah, let's take it. Sorry.
Yeah. 2 things. The first thing is, I got my head around it, and the one thing that sold me was, I kept thinking, I live in New York, I'm a Green Party person, by the way, and the notorious legislature in this state, how would you get through it? When you pointed out the self-interest in it, oh good, okay. Now I know that's the only thing that drives it. But the second thing is, I know Fair Vote has for many years been an advocate of IRB as our Free Party people. How does that fit into this structure?
Got that one. And one more? Yes.
I've got a 2-part question. I'm a practicing political scientist, okay? I'm a political scientist, and I'm also a public official. I have been one for 26 years old. Anyway, 2 parts. One, in New York State, I saw that it passed one house of the legislature, which is classic New York State. I know it's probably passed the Assembly. It hasn't passed the Senate. Of course, the New York State Senate is controlled by the Democrats, and what the Democrats in the New York State Senate found out is who is the biggest bozo among us, and they made that person the leader. Okay, what I wanted to know, my question is, if Democrats do control the state Senate, does it have any possibility of passing the state Senate? And that's the question for Rob this year.
Good. Well, let's start.
Okay. Well, another question. My other question is, I know you're talking to state legislators and things like that. What I was thinking of, the state of Maine, as you know, it has initiative. It's one of the very few East Coast states that does. And it's a very small state. I mean, I wouldn't suggest trying an initiative in California because it costs millions and millions of dollars. But maybe if you got some money, you might start one in Maine. And my feeling is that this is a fairly easy sell. It's not easy to explain. It's complicated to explain. I'm a political scientist, I teach it. And it's complicated to explain. And to the average citizen, the eyes wash over. The other, just a comment that people are talking about small states and big states, we have television, we have the internet, all these democratizing type of media. I think that'll be helpful. Thank you. Thanks for coming today. We're going to be here till 2.
Yeah, there's like, and that's not really 2:30, just so anyone can.
Okay, it's not 1:30.
So let me just make a couple comments and then I'll pass the microphone here. What I just want to say about National popular vote is moving. There are bills in every state, and the last state is Idaho, that is just getting a bill in January. And states where it's gone all the way, we didn't always know it was going to go all the way. So New York is one of those states where it's in play. It actually hasn't passed the chamber yet, but it has passed a committee. Yeah. But it's in play, and it's a state where there's a lot of reasons to have it be working. You know, I think there's going to be several states where it's going to move in the coming year, building on the successes that it's had, and it's sort of fun to see how those states can emerge. It can be where a legislator says, you know, I'm that 7th grader that always wanted to do this, and now I'm speaker, you know. I can't even read my scribble, but I will talk about instant runoff voting. Before I talk about instant runoff voting, a point I've been meaning to make, because it sort of is woven in a couple times to what we're saying, is just this: what does it really matter to have states focus on some states, candidates focus on some states and not others? But one clear measurement was in the 2004 election. Eligible voters under 30, so that's people who are 18 to 29, eligible to vote, voted at a rate of 64% in the 10 most contested states, which was actually almost the same as older voters. I think we're at 67% in those states. In the rest of the country, that same demographic, 18 to 29-year-olds, 47% turnout. So really big difference, and it's because they were engaged in a very different way. And then that means that over time their participation will be different. So I think that points to sort of a good government value. Another good government value for us is instant runoff voting, changing winner-take-all elections. For those who were, I put actually some brochures on instant runoff voting because it's becoming an issue. I'm going to be up next week testifying to the New York State Senate Committee on Elections about the citywide primary you just had, where you had a runoff and the turnout was single digits and it cost $20 million in public tax dollars for it. Got very negative, it wasn't very substantive, and like people are saying, why are we doing this? Well, one of the reasons to do it is to make sure that winners are representative, and sometimes that's not going to be the case if you don't have some threshold of what it takes to win. And for those who aren't familiar with instant runoff voting, grab that brochure, but it's a way to accommodate choice when you have more than 2 candidates and try to generate a representative winner who is a majority winner rather than a non-majority winner. And we think that's a good proposal. We're out there fighting for it in it's on the ballot in several cities today. It's being used for the first time in Minneapolis for their mayoral races and other races. It's being used in San Francisco, some other offices. And I think if you look at the New Jersey elections and a 3-candidate race, and we don't know how to handle it, right? It's like, well, instant runoff voting is a system that does that. It is not part of the National Popular Vote Plan because it's not something that any individual state can kind of inject into the National Popular Vote Plan. We don't have it, of course, for presidential elections anywhere right now. I think that it's a next step conversation for us. And in the meantime, we see lots of opportunities to advance that proposal and accommodate choice better in our state and local, in all federal races actually, except president. We can do that right now, and that's something that we're out there fighting for.
Getting to the question of, is this on? Okay. Of the 1-year blackout, the legal arrangement. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but when I sat around the teams of lawyers that did this, they wanted to have a clear legal justification for a timeline, whatever we chose. So the 6-month window between the conventions and the inauguration, they also wanted the shortest period. So that was very easy to justify. But the bottom line is, even if, no matter who the candidate becomes, it's pretty hard to argue really with much conviction it's going to go one way or the other. Last summer, I read dozens of articles that supposed that Barack Obama would get the most votes and lose the Electoral College, or vice versa would happen for McCain. You know, that far away, it's really impossible to predict. And another question about New York State progress. Let me just give you some bill numbers if people are interested. The Senate bill, Senator Parker is our lead sponsor, S2286, and in the Assembly Member Dinowitz, 1580, Jeff Dinowitz. And I should say we have a good team in Albany that actually includes the Working Families Party. It's been very helpful to our effort, came on board as a priority for them about a year and a half ago, and they have been very helpful as we've been advancing. And we have advanced pretty far. We're in rules in the Assembly, and we were scheduled for a committee vote on a Tuesday. You might all remember that Monday I was in Albany, and that was quite something. We had suddenly no state Senate majority. So the day after the coup, we would have been out of committee in the Senate, which is to say we have support, but definitely hearing from grassroots, from real constituents, urging folks to pass this bill would be a great help. And if you go to nationalpopularvote.com, scroll to the bottom, there's an easy tool there to write your legislator. Do you want me to take the initiative one?
What's Adam and Kruger's position?
I think they're both supportive, but I deal with a lot of states, so I get confused with the names. Maine has an initiative, the thought was, and why wouldn't you put this on the ballot? We've definitely discussed that kind of a strategy. Washington State, like Maine, has a way for the people's referendum to undo what the legislature's done. There was some dust-up when Washington State passed our bill, but they didn't come anywhere close to getting the signatures because 80% of the public likes this idea. But it's been our thinking that it's hard, perhaps, to sell it to voters so early on. It's not like, if Maine votes for this, we have a popular vote for president. It's sort of saying, if Maine votes for this, we're in queue to have a popular vote for president. That's a little harder political struggle. But we're not opposed to the initiative. It does take a large amount of resources. But legally, the people can act as the legislature. In terms of passing our bill. You know, we've talked a lot about mechanics, and we haven't talked about real politics in terms of policy that I think maybe might make a nice connection for some of you who think this is a little bit interesting, but come on, we got real world problems of billion-dollar budget deficits and healthcare and so forth. And I just want to say that since I've worked on this project, it is unbelievable to observe American politics and presidential politics if you think about it through this lens. So for instance, it's not just little things like Obama signs his stimulus package in Indiana and does a healthcare town meeting in New Hampshire. Big surprise there, even though it's 3 years to go. It's deeper than that. You have George Bush, an ardent free trader, who vehemently opposes any limits on trade, but he puts a tariff on steel. Why does he do that? Well, the steel industry is vital to Ohio. Why does he, again, someone who's not enamored with big government, pass Medicare Part D, thought to be the largest entitlement program since some of Lyndon Johnson's programs in early 2000s? Vital to Florida. You have Al Gore, who thinks a lot about environmental issues and renewable energy, didn't really campaign on renewable energy. Why is that? Well, the coal industry is central to Ohio and Pennsylvania. So you see these coincidences. John McCain came out very strongly for offshore oil drilling, an idea that is absolutely poisonous along the West Coast, where much of that drilling would happen. But Washington, Oregon, and California are blue states. So if John McCain loses another 5% in those states because of that position, it's absolutely meaningless for him. He does not care if he loses California by 3% or 35%. He just loses the prize. If you have a popular vote for president, politicians are always going to make political calculations. That's the way the game works. But right now they're making it on a happy accident of which 6 to 10 states happen to be in play. And that does not represent our country well at all. And it's a major motivating factor for me and why I think this is so vital.
Maybe one more question and then we'll probably wrap up.
Question there in the back?
Yes, this seems a very valuable and this seems to be a very valuable and imaginative thing that you're doing, but we haven't heard, or maybe I just missed it, the name of the person who thought of it.
Sure.
Well, the guy, it has roots outside of this, but the guy who kind of came up with it and has sparked it is a kind of an eccentric computer professor from Stanford who made a fortune because he invented the scratch-off lottery ticket, which, you know, greatly lowered the morals of America. So he's making up for it with this idea, and he doesn't have any particular axe to grind that I know of beside that. His name is Dr. John R. Koza, K-O-Z-A. And this, you know, this is a funny kind of reform because it's not obviously in the interest of either party. You know, both parties have shown that they can win national elections. It's not exactly clear whose interest it serves, except for the interest of individual human beings who would like to be equal citizens of a democratic republic. It does serve those interests. The applause makes me want to stop.
Always good to do. Let me just, first of all, as we close out, I want to thank everybody who came today. This has been a really lively and wonderful discussion. Thanks to you and your participation. And before I thank our speakers, I want to take the sponsor's prerogative for a moment here. I know you all came to talk about national popular vote, but whether you're for it or against it, I think you're all here because you really believe in improving our democracy. So I just have to share some good news that we just got about another reform that Demos has been working on for a long time, which is election day registration, or also called same-day registration. We found out just, I think, within the last hour or so, the D.C. City Council unanimously enacted and passed same-day registration for their elections, along with some other very good reforms in a bill they just enacted. So, just thank you for giving me the chance to say that, and to say that, you know, whatever reform you care about in terms of improving our democracy, keep working on it, keep the momentum going, and sometimes there'll be victories. But let me also, as we close, just thank our three speakers here today, Rob Ritchie, Chris Pearson, Hendrick Hertzberg. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.